Thanks for listening to the Northeast Divide podcast. I'm your host, John Lane, as always. And tonight I'm joined not by Anth, but by Alex Hurst, who is from the True Faith Podcast, who you may have heard one or two things about in the last couple of months as we've been recording this. Anth cannot be with us tonight, but I think we're going to talk about the Newcastle United season overall and go into that. But before we do all that, I do need to mention that this episode is sponsored by The Crackling Guy. There's going to be a link in the bottom of this podcast for you to explore that. And if you do mention Northeast Divide Podcast, there is a 10% discount on Crackling. I've tried the stuff myself. It's great. Give it a go. Alex, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Before we get into Newcastle's season, and I'm going to try and delay that as much as I can get away with, how did you Newcastle United journey start, I suppose, and then how did podcasting all happen? Because give us a bit of an overview.
Hi John. Yep, was born here, born in the city, so that pretty much self explains. If you're a football fan and you're born in the city, normally particularly in the 90s, you're a Newcastle United fan. So born here by the grace of God, really, as they say. But podcast journey started around 2014. Really, to be blunt, I just got sick of other Newcastle podcasters and podcasts who weren't at the games. Not to say they're bad podcasts or bad at what they're doing, but at the time, there was no one. I was listening to these podcasts, having been at home games and away games, and it was obvious they were just watching highlights or watching streams. Nothing wrong with that, of course, but I just felt there was a gap for a market for a podcast where people were at the games. And, there wasn't a grand plan. It wasn't a long-term ambition. It was just, I think it was at Stoke away in 2014, and like the away end basically chanted for the removal of Pardew all game, which was a piss take in itself, and I wasn't happy with that. But you just wouldn't know that if you weren't there. So that was it, really.
Cool, fantastic. So let's get into the season then. What were your expectations going into this year, and kind of how far away have Newcastle United delivered from that this year for you?
Yeah, I thought Newcastle would improve on last season. I thought they'd at least remain in Europe for the new year, and I thought that they'd improve the team in January, and they did none of those things. There's lots of mitigation, as I'm sure you've talked about on the show, but I still think that they've gone backwards, and the issue with going backwards is it's okay, but it puts a lot of pressure on the following season and seasons not to go backwards again. And, a lot of the rhetoric that comes out of the club and Eddie Howe about not taking a step back, it just hasn't happened, sadly.
Yeah, and I think that's the frustrating bit, isn't it, really? I think if we'd finished 7th last year and we'd finished 4th this year, I think there's completely different conversations happening, but it absolutely feels like a backward step because, we're 3 places lower down the league. We've kind of tried to ride our luck through the year. And I think if we look at kind of the big moments, and this is obviously what I've talked about in the last couple of weeks, the big moments we just haven't seized. We've just kind of let go, and that's, I'll include the cup final last year in that. But also, if you look at AC Milan at home, Chelsea away, Man United the other week, I mean, they're all massive opportunities to achieve what we wanted to. And for some reason, we haven't delivered that. I mean, what do you reckon? Do you think that comes down? Is that a character thing? Is it a mentality thing? Is it not enough quality or bad luck?
I just don't think Newcastle are a great side, and you've got to be a really good team to take the opportunities when they're presented to you, and they're just not. They're a decent side, particularly at home. In fact, a really strong side at home, but away from home in particular, they're just not a good team. Spent most of the season in the bottom 4, bottom 5 of the away Premier League table, which isn't an important table, but is an instructive table on how a team is. And even in home games, they just play without any control. Particularly after December. So it's just, they finished 7th, they finished joint with 8th. They probably just are the 7th or 8th best team in the league, and you aren't a good team. You're not bad, you're not terrible, but you're not a good team if you finish 8th. mean, West Ham finished 9th. No one thinks West Ham are a good team. Man U and Chelsea are changing managers for finishing 6th and 8th, respectively. And Newcastle, just this season anyway, they're just not a good side.
Yeah, and I think you touched on it there. I mean, it's a massive summer ahead, I suppose, kind of going into that. I mean, there's been some highlights though this year. Several, I think, and even if we haven't achieved maybe what we wanted to, I do think that there are some big moments there. I mean, what sticks out for you in your mind? As kind of your highlight from the season overall.
I mean, yeah, like you say, there was lots of moments that'll be remembered for a long time. I think, I mean, personally, being in the San Siro in Milan for a proper big fixture in September, that was pretty good, because Newcastle don't play many big games in September normally, and haven't done for many years. So that was a pretty special memory, particularly before the game, and the kind of culture that the Milan fans have, completely different to England. That was really good. People will always talk about the PSG game. That was obviously very good. I kind of, it's a little bit tainted for me, because we had 4 points from 2 games, and we just needed to beat Dortmund at home, I think, to qualify almost, or knock Dortmund out, because they had 1 point. They would have had 1 point from 3 games. But, special night to be in the city, be in the ground, all that kind of thing. And to be fair, we did a show last week, and Mark Douglas said, actually, Man City hardly lose a domestic cup game. So I suppose beating them 1-0 at home, and I think they were only missing Haaland and De Bruyne. They were missing a few others, but it was by no means a shadow team. I thought that was a pretty good night, because Howe did put out a much rotated team, and then they managed to win the game. So yeah, that was a pretty big win.
Yeah, Lewis Hall playing, I think 3 positions in the first half, and then there was 2 changes, wasn't it? Gordon and Bruno came on the second half, and the game just kind of changed pace. I think it's very difficult to look past PSG for me, just in terms of it was the opening game at St James's Park. I went with the boys, and it was their first chance to kind of experience that, and I think all of that kind of thing. We did some stuff with TNT as well, so that was pretty special. And overall, for the performance, and most of the players that starred, they weren't, it wasn't Isak, it wasn't Gordon, it was Almiron with the opening goal, Longstaff, Dan Burn, and and then Cher rounding off the way that he did. It was a pretty special night. But I also think a special mention for Man United away in the League Cup. I just felt like that night we played them off the park. It looked like a team that played together like for 8-9 months, and looked really comfortable together. And I don't think we see enough of that, and that's probably, you look at that and think that's great, but then it just hasn't delivered on that.
The issue is, John, you're right, and it's always, for Newcastle to win at Old Trafford, just never happens to win 3-0. Man U, I can't get away from the fact Man U just rubbish. I think it's just a really, really bad football team who should have finished about 14th in the league. Don't want to take anything away from the people that were there, because, to go and battle old Man U at Old Trafford, it's special. But I think in season context, it's actually not a brilliant result, because Man U were just so bad, particularly in that competition.
Yeah. I mean, look, I agree they were bad that night, but I felt like what the refreshing bit for me was, it was a very changed lineup, but they played the way that the first team would play, and that almost in some ways makes other parts of the season more disappointing when you look at it, because we had to play with massive changes all the way through the year, and then that was almost used as it wasn't an excuse by Howe, certainly not. I certainly didn't see that in press conferences or anything, but I think certainly from the wider kind of Newcastle community, there was a lot of talk about fatigue and injuries, and we spoke about it on the Patreon pods as well. So look, I think there's a lot there in terms of what the team could have done, and maybe that's just that lingering what if, I suppose. Here to bring the podcast down, low light. where would you go with that low point of the season?
Yeah, well, there's a few, isn't there? I actually think, personally, it was after Luton at home. because we were back in the territory of, and even though it was just online conversation and some real conversations, we're back in the territory of just a completely divided fan base. Drawing 4-4 at home with Luton was absolutely dreadful, in my opinion. Luton were rubbish this season. They didn't get 30 points. They were a rubbish team. Their budget, they probably overperformed in terms of their budget and expectation. But yeah, Luton at home for me.
Yeah, I can totally understand that. I was in the ground that day, 4-2 down, just thinking, what on earth is going on? Absolutely no comprehension of where that came from. And I think you're right. I think and you are either an an Eddie sympathizer or an Eddie out, and it's kind of like it's okay to kind of be in the middle of that, to say, well, this isn't good enough. But I think the nature of obviously social media and how that drives, it is very polarized, and I think, that was a low. I think for me, I'll go back to AC Milan at home. That's the one that sticks out, because I just think we're 25 minutes away from getting to the Champions League. I think the other one I mentioned the other night on one of our pods was Man City away in the FA Cup, because I think it was almost that realization of how far away we are from where we want to be. There was this really polished winning machine that just delivered, and once they went 1-0 up, the game was done. It felt like when the draw was made, it was kind of like, I would have taken anyone at home, including Man City. I kept saying, actually, if we beat City at home, then that gives us a real good chance of winning the FA Cup. But then to draw them away and to not even be near the contest, I think was a real sobering moment. And that one really sticks out for me. If you had to choose a player of the season, who would you go for, Alex?
I'd actually go for Bruno Guimaraes, which is I've not really seen talked about often, but what we needed this season was availability, and he gave it to us. I think there's one game, Bournemouth away, and got beat, unsurprisingly. Don't ever win with him. And I just think the fact that he changed his game so much to avoid that last Buchan to be suspended for two games when there was no one else. You're talking 5 at the back, 2 midfielders, Miley and Longstaff as the only 2 players. And this is a period when Longstaff was, injured or otherwise one of the worst performances I've ever seen at Premier League level, probably from kind of January to April. He improved after that. He got better towards the end of the season. But I just thought he took responsibility. And, it's a weird season because we finished 7th. We haven't got Europe. But there's enough in the tank there for people to look forward to next season. There's enough there to suggest Newcastle might be okay. I think if Bruno Guimaraes gets injured after January or gets suspended or gets sent off or loses form at any point, and you're looking at a bottom 10 finish, and the whole conversation changes without him. And I appreciate the contributions of Gordon and Isak in an attacking sense have been brilliant. But I think without Guimaraes behind them, it just doesn't happen. So yeah, he's mine, John.
I think Bruno's world class, and I think he's shown that the last couple of years. Obviously, there's a whole conversation at the moment of if you had to lose a player between Isak and Bruno, who do you lose? But just if you say you wouldn't want to lose Isak, it doesn't mean you want to lose Bruno. He's done a phenomenal job, and you're right he became better because of how disciplined he had to be, and he'd never been a disciplined midfielder for us. He'd always been, a little bit too much on the edge at times. I think sending off in the semi-final against Southampton, is one that sticks out in mind, where actually there was just that rush to the head. There was Arsenal where it felt like he was trying to get booked, so he missed Bournemouth. So then, his suspension would reset, and there was, it was close. Could he potentially been sent off in that game? But no, I think that's a good shout. For me, Anthony Gordon sticks out. Just the improvement he made. He went to the Euros for the under-21s, did an amazing job there. He had a week off before coming back to pre-season, and he's just grafted, and he now looks, for me, a 9-figure player. He really does look at that level, and we've got a real talent there. And for me, he was standout. But totally understand the opinion on Bruno. He's done a remarkable job not to get that 10th booking, and even didn't get that 10th booking when he could have had it at the end of the season. So it just shows how much he really has adapted his game. All right, if you had to set a realistic target or ambition for next season, Alex, what you're saying? What we're going to do next year?
Realistically, for next season, they've got to try and get back in the top 4. If you talk about, well, we know players have been talked about in terms of projects and things like that. If this is a project, you can't convince Guimaraes to ignore Arsenal and Juventus or whoever, and Isak to sign for Newcastle and sell them a project, and that project include 2 or 3 years out of top 4 football once you've reached it. So I don't think it'll be a failure to finish 5th or a couple of points behind, but you've got to be in the conversation getting into March, April. You've got to give yourself that position of getting in. I think, fans are desperate for domestic trophies. Players are desperate. Management's everyone's desperate for domestic trophies. But if they finish 9th next year and win a cup, a lot of fans will probably take that, but ownership wouldn't. A lot of the players in the squad wouldn't. It's all about getting back in that Champions League, mate.
I think that Champions League absolutely has to be the target for next season. I don't disagree with you. I think absolute minimum requirement is European qualification, hopefully through winning a trophy. But I think but yeah, absolutely. We've not got any European football next year. We've just got domestic football. We can really attack all 3 fronts and give it a good go. And Villa are going to have to balance Champions League football this year for the first time. Conference League balancing is not the same as Champions League balancing for me. They are, unless they strengthen, and I think they're in a similar boat to us in terms of PSR and all that kind of stuff. So they're not going to be able to go out and sign loads of players. Chelsea are in transition again. Man United are probably going to be in transition again. And there's a massive job there. So, and then you've got Slot going in at Liverpool. Look, I think there's opportunities there, isn't there, really, to kind of break into that and almost do something.
Yeah, very much so, pal. And you said on pods a few times that we've done, John, that you kind of feel, if they'd done the seasons the other way around, that there'll be less pressure and views would have changed. But I disagree with you slightly, because Newcastle got 4th Newcastle should have finished 3rd last season, but they didn't. And again, I think that's part of that not taking the opportunities quite granted to them, albeit you don't get anything extra for 3rd apart from another couple of million quid. But it would have been a kind of a bigger statement to me. They won one of the last 5 games at the end of 22-23. They kind of tailed off. But the reason they got top 4 last season is because Liverpool presented them with that opportunity. So if Newcastle had finished 7th last season, it would have looked way more difficult this season to try and get in the top 4 moving forward. Like, until you've done it, it seems like the impossible job. And people would have looked at Aston Villa this season and said, those guys could do it. But Aston Villa, even though they've had some pretty major injuries, the core of their squad, all of their key players, have played over 33 games. Ignoring Tyrone Mings at the start of the season, but there's an argument to say he doesn't get in Villa's starting 11 with some Villa fans. So I just don't know. I just think Liverpool granted Newcastle the opportunity last season, because Liverpool have a normal season and finish on like 85 points, say 83, 85 points. Newcastle finished 5th last season, so they had to take that opportunity presented to them, which they did, which is great. So I just feel like they've got to do something next season similar, but with the assumption that, or the hope that, one of those teams has a Liverpool type drop off. And like you said, their Liverpool new manager could be them, also could not be them. And that's why it's so difficult, because if Chelsea's manager works out and then they spend again, which is a big if Man United get the right man in finally and spend big again. My issue with what a lot of fans say regarding, and we get this a lot in comments on Patreon about, imagine where we were 3 years ago. Imagine where we were 4 years ago. Right, that's great. Yeah, let's do lots of imagining. Football doesn't work like that. Newcastle are locked out of the top 6 financially. They're locked out. They can't catch up. So when they do breach it, they've got to stay in it, and they've got to maximise every season that they're ahead of the game. They're now behind again. all of the top six, because all of the top six have got European football next season and Newcastle don't. So it's all about, John, I don't know if you've heard this or I've told you before, but I was fortunate to speak to Rafa Benitez quite a few years ago when we were in the Championship, and Newcastle, the first time I spoke to him, Newcastle had just lost their first two fixtures to Fulham and Huddersfield. Hugely unexpected, Newcastle to lose both of those games to the teams that had finished 19th and 20th the previous season. Turns out they were pretty good. Huddersfield ended up going up. But Rafa wasn't panicking. But he was also planning to be a top six side in the Premier League within a couple of seasons. Now, that was ridiculous for me to hear and the other people I was with to hear, because we were like bottom of the Championship after 2 games. I wasn't panicking either. I thought we'd get promoted, but this is Mike Ashley's Newcastle. But Rafa was absolutely certain of one thing: other teams were going to mess up big style. And they ended up doing that and have ended up doing that in the years since. So that someone will mess up next season. All of these teams aren't going to be great. All of the managers won't be there, I'm sure, at the end of the season, probably. But it's only so good saying that and imagining that if you're going to be ruthless enough to take one of their places and expect to take one of their places, because this kind of, well, imagine where we were 4 years ago. Great, we were shit 4 years ago, but PIF put in £500 million and we just finished 7th. And there's a lot of mitigation for that. And we might have, if Nick Pope doesn't get injured, we might have finished 5th or 4th. But they spent £500 million and we finished 7th. You can't keep, it's just not sustainable in football to be doing that. The club's losing £73 million a year at the minute. Reality will bite eventually if we don't kick on.
No, you're right. I mean, if you're whoever's going to be responsible for what happens in the summer in terms of players in and out, what would you be doing? What do you think needs to happen in the summer if we're going to finish in the top 4 next year? As you said, really needs to be the aim.
Well, there's more knowledgeable people than I have said consistently they've got to sell some players, some first-team players, or players in the first-team picture. Sean Longstaff, I would sell in a heartbeat if there was a decent offer made. Jacob Murphy, Miguel Almiron, they're players that you'd think would attract bids. Elliot Anderson might be vulnerable because he's kind of come in and done well, but then very clearly been left out of the starting 11 whenever a better player was available. So we've got to get rid of some players. Callum Wilson for me is an automatic exit. If you can get anything, you can get 10 million for Callum Wilson. I'm biting your hand off. Huge space on the wage bill he's creating too. In terms of bringing in players, right winger, absolutely crucial. They've probably got a lot of central midfielders already if everyone stays fit, particularly with the emergence in Miley. And then even if Wilson stays, but I hope he doesn't, you need another centre forward, someone to... It's a really hard position to fill because assuming Isaac stays, it's hard to attract someone who's not going to play. There is talk if they want someone who can play right and through the middle, but I almost feel a lot of the time with these players, people say Anthony Gordon can play through the middle, but he can't. You wouldn't in a million years choose to play Anthony Gordon through the middle ahead of Alexander Isak. So I think we need to bring in a striker, someone who can really push Isak onto the next level, because that's maybe what Isak's missing. And talk of needing a centre back and being linked with centre backs because they're going to be missing Botman and Lascelles for a good chunk of next season. So it's pretty essential, really, they bring in a centre back. Otherwise, it's you've just got Byrne and Shaw. How about you, mate?
Yeah, I think what will happen is if we can get Kelly and Tosin on freeze, and look, Tosin's getting contract offers left, right, and centre. I think whoever's there, his agent is doing a very good job. But if they can get those two done, I think you may see Fabian Schär leave. I like Fabian Schär. I think he's had an incredible season, probably up there with one of the players of the year as well, to be fair, with the kind of performances that he's turned out. But I think it's probably the right time. You'd probably still get an all right fee for him, £5 million or what have you. We bought him for 8 years ago. That's not terrible business. But I think, I agree. Right wing, really important position to fill. And then we need to be looking at a forward. You said about Isak, and I've said it about, when Wilson's fit, Isak's a better player. when Wilson's fit, and similarly, Wilson's a better player when Isak's fit. You need someone who is genuinely can think that they've got competition there, and Isak needs to think that genuinely there's a chance that he could be left out if he's not on his game. So I agree that's all important, but it's how you get that money in, I suppose, and do that. And I go back to all the linked players. I don't think it's a coincidence that Trippier and Almiron and Wilson were all linked with moves away in January. I think they're the players that potentially go in the summer, or certainly the club will be looking to potentially move on in the summer. It was interesting what you said about Jacob Murphy. I agree that he should be a squad player at best. He shouldn't be starting games every week, but I don't think you get a massive fee for him. But I think you could still probably utilise, and I still think you need that squad player, but he needs to be number 19, 20 in the squad, not number 13, 14 for me. So I probably don't let him go, but I think hopefully the quality you bring in moves him slightly further down the pecking order. Alex, I've really enjoyed that. Thank you very much for coming on and spending time. Before we go, do you want to remind listeners where they can find you?
Yeah, just True Faith Podcast, which we're very fortunate to have John is a major part of. So you just have to search True Faith NUFC into YouTube or into any podcast platform, and you'll hear us every single week.
Fantastic. Alex, thank you very much for your time, and thanks to all of you for listening. If you've liked the video, please press the like button below. And then, of course, if you just leave us any comments for any feedback on our social media platforms or on YouTube at Northeast Divide. Thank you very much, and goodbye.